Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're taking a look at, well, kind of a sensitive, maybe even controversial subject, at least for some people. We're going to be digging into the first vision in Mormonism. And, you know, I was going over the source material you sent.
Right.
It really raises some interesting questions about, like, when this whole story actually became common knowledge.
Yeah.
And how its importance has kind of, changed over time. So I guess our goal today is to kind of unpack all that, you know.
That's exactly it.
Look at the when, the how, the why.
Yeah.
And see what we can learn about how significant this first vision really is.
Totally. And the materials you sent, they highlight some really important questions like, when did this story actually become something that everybody in the church knew about?
Yeah.
The sources seem to point to the 1840s. You know, that's when it started showing up in publications more broadly.
Right.
And then in the 1880s, that's when it gets officially added to their scriptures.
Right. Canonization.
Exactly. Canonization. So that makes you think, right, like, why wasn't it a bigger deal back in 1830 when they were just getting the church off the ground?
Right. It's like, you'd think that would be the time to really be talking about it, right? Front and center.
You would think.
But the early records, at least what we have, don't really seem to focus on it.
Not so much, no.
And it gets even more and more interesting when you look at what else was going on at that time, religiously, I mean.
Oh, yeah.
Your sources talk about these other guys like Norris Stearns back in 1815.
Right.
Charles Finney around the same time, and Elias Smith in 1816. They all had these visionary experiences.
They did.
So how did those compare to what Joseph Smith said happened to him?
It's a great question.
And do your sources say anything about whether they influenced each other?
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle.
And then there's the whole question of why it took so long for the first vision story to really become something everyone knew about. Like, your sources talk about how there's not a lot of documentation about it in those first few years after the church was organized in the 1830s.
Yeah.
And it wasn't shared much either.
It seems that way from the record, yeah.
And, we can't avoid the elephant in the room. I mean, we've got to address what President Hinckley said.
Right.
He basically said, if the first vision didn't happen, then the whole church is a fraud.
Right.
So that raises the stakes, right? We've got to look at all this history you've provided and figure out how it fits with faith, both for people who are firm believers.
Absolutely.
And for folks who, maybe aren't so sure.
100%. Okay, so should we just dive right in?
Let's do it. Let's start with the very beginning.
Yeah.
April 6th, 1830. That's when the church was officially organized.
Yeah.
Right there in the Whitmer home in Fayette, New York.
Yeah.
And your sources are really clear that this wasn't just some random gathering.
Right.
They were actually following through on very specific instructions that had been given back in June of 1829.
That's right. They were carrying out something that had already been set in motion.
So what really sticks out to me is what they focused on at that first meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Your sources talk about how Oliver Cowdery ordained Joseph Smith as, and this is a quote, prophet, seer, etc.
Prophet, seer, etc.
Based on a revelation. And David Whitmer backs that up. He said there was a revelation telling Cowdery to ordain Joseph as, again, I'm quoting here, prophet, seer, and revelator to the church. With the really important point being that Joseph's words should be taken as coming directly from God.
Right. So the authority is really being established right there, right from the get-go.
Exactly. And according to your sources, it seems like the main focus at that time was on, following those instructions that had been given earlier. And establishing Joseph Smith as this prophet, like, they were hammering home the idea that revelation was the foundation of the church.
It seems that way.
And that Joseph Smith had this very specific calling as prophet, seer, and revelator.
Yeah. That's really emphasized. And what's super interesting is that the first vision doesn't get mentioned in any of this.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. It's almost like it wasn't really part of their thinking yet at that point.
It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah, like how important could it have been to them if it wasn't even mentioned at this big organizational meeting? I mean, this was the founding moment, right?
Exactly. It does raise questions about how central the narrative was at that time. The focus seems to have been more on Joseph's ability to receive ongoing revelation rather than on a single past event.
Okay, so let's move on to the 1830s, those early years of the church. It sounds like Joseph Smith had a lot on his plate.
Oh, yeah. He had to deal with some pretty intense stuff right off the bat.
Your sources mentioned persecution, especially in Colesville. And then there were guys like Hiram Page popping up, claiming they were getting revelations too.
Right, and that caused some real turmoil, understandably. People were trying to figure out who to believe, what was true.
Right, so it seems like the priority for Joseph Smith was, keeping things together, establishing order, making sure everyone was on the same page with doctrine. And the way he did that, according to your sources, was through constant revelation.
It seems so, yeah. Ongoing revelation was really the key to addressing those challenges.
Okay, so here's something that I found really striking.
What's that?
One of your sources says that the very first published history of the Mormons, the one Oliver Cowdery, started writing in 1834 with Joseph Smith's help, mind you.
Right.
It completely ignores the first vision. It's like it never even happened.
Wow. It's a pretty big omission if you think about it.
It really is. I mean, this is the very first attempt to tell the story of the Mormons. And the event that's now considered like the cornerstone of their whole belief system, it's just not there.
Right. It definitely suggests that the first vision narrative wasn't seen as essential to understanding the origins of the church at that point.
Exactly. And, it wasn't until 1842 that Joseph Smith finally publishes his own description of the first vision.
That's over a decade after the church was founded.
Over a decade. Your sources also quote this guy, James B. Allen, a former BYU professor who was also an assistant church historian.
Okay.
And he says there's barely any evidence that Joseph Smith was even talking about the first vision publicly in those early 1830s.
Interesting.
So if he was telling this story, why wasn't anyone writing it down?
Good point.
You'd think it would be important enough to record. And even more telling, your source mentions that no one criticized Joseph Smith for not talking about the first vision during this period.
That's very telling, actually.
Yeah. If it was really considered this crucial foundational event, wouldn't people have been asking, hey, what about that vision you had?
You'd think so, yeah.
And your sources really drive this point home. They talk about how there's almost no mention of the first vision in any of the writings from that time, whether it's church publications, personal journals, letters, anything.
It seems like it wasn't really circulating much at all. It makes you wonder what else might have been considered more important at that time.
Right. So we've got this period where the first vision seems to be almost absent. And then in the 1840s, things start to change.
Things do start to shift.
Your sources point to Orson Pratt as the first person to actually publish an account of the first vision. He had a pamphlet that he put out in Edinburgh in 1840.
Right, and it's important to remember the context here. Orson Pratt was really active in the early missionary efforts, especially over in Britain.
Right.
He was trying to drum up interest in Mormonism, and of course he knew Joseph Smith personally. So this pamphlet was his way of introducing the story to a British audience. It was a huge step in making the first vision more publicly known.
Okay, that makes sense. And then a couple of years later, in 1842, Joseph Smith himself publishes his own account in the Times and Seasons.
Right, and your sources mention that he did that because someone asked him for a history of the church.
So it's kind of like an official authorized version, right?
Exactly, and it's the first time his account appears in print in the United States, so it starts to become more widely available to people in America.
Okay. And then in 1844, there's another publication, Israel Daniel Rupp's History of Religious Denominations.
Yeah.
Which your sources say is basically just a reprint of what Joseph Smith had already published in 1842.
So it seems like the first vision is starting to gain some real traction here in the 1840s. It's going from something that was barely talked about to being included in these important historical works. And I think we can connect this to the bigger picture. Missionary work is expanding, public interest in Mormonism is growing, and there's also criticism starting to surface. So it makes sense that the first vision would become more important as a way to explain the origins of the church and respond to those outside voices.
Okay, so fast forward a few decades.
1880.
Yeah, so a big turning point.
This is when Joseph Smith history, which includes that 1838 account of the first vision, it gets canonized. It becomes part of the Pearl of Great Price, October 10th, 1880. That's right. And, canonized sounds like this really formal, almost intimidating word. But basically what it means is that the first vision officially became part of the church's scriptures.
Right.
And that, that elevated its status significantly. It went from being one person's story to being something considered sacred and authoritative for the entire church.
Right. Like, it's not just history anymore. It's doctrine. It's truth.
Exactly. And, this is really important because it ensures that the first vision would be studied and taught widely within the church. It became central to their understanding of their own history and beliefs.
Okay, so we've gone from almost no mention of the first vision in those early years
Right.
to it being published in the 1840s, and then
Yeah.
boom, it's official scripture in 1880.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating evolution.
It really is. Okay, so let's switch gears for a minute and talk about those other guys you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
The ones who had those visionary experiences around the same time as Joseph Smith.
Right, like Norris Stearns, Charles Finney, and Elias Smith.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about what the religious landscape was like back then. Like, your sources paint this picture of the burned over district as this hotbed of religious revivalism.
Oh, yeah. It was a time of incredible religious fervor and experimentation. People were searching for spiritual truth, and these intense experiences were, in some ways, pretty common.
Wow. So Norris Stearns, back in 1815 in Greenfield, Massachusetts,
Right.
he describes this feeling of God's love washing over him, this bright light appearing.
Mm-hmm.
And then he sees two spirits who he identifies as God and Jesus Christ. He even goes into detail about what they look like and how they spoke to him.
It's a really powerful account.
It is. And then there's Charles Finney.
Around the same time, yeah.
He's in Adams, New York.
Mm.
And he has these visions, first in the woods and then later on in his law office.
Right, and initially he describes it as an encounter with Jesus. But what's interesting is that as Finney becomes more prominent as a Presbyterian minister, he starts to downplay the physical aspects of his vision. Yeah, it's like he was trying to fit it more into a conventional theological framework.
Interesting. And what about Elias Smith?
He's mentioned in your sources as having a similar vision in 1816, but unfortunately they don't provide any specific details about what he actually experienced.
That's too bad. I'd love to know more about that. But, what really struck me is that your sources directly ask whether these other visionary experiences might have influenced Joseph Smith. I mean, he was right there in the middle of this burned over district, right?
Exactly, and it's not unreasonable to think that he might have heard about these other visions, especially given how intensely religious the atmosphere was.
And one of your sources even calls Joseph Smith an adept remixer, suggesting that he might have incorporated elements from these other accounts into his own narrative.
It's a provocative claim, for sure, but it raises interesting questions about how stories circulate and evolve within a particular culture and time period.
It really does. And, it's fascinating to think about how these different individuals interpreted their own experiences. Some, like Joseph Smith, doubled down on the reality and importance of their visions,
Right.
while others, like Charles Finney, seemed to back away from them as time went on.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what factors might have influenced those different approaches, right? Was it personality? Was it the theological system they were working within? Was it the reaction they got from others? There's so much to consider.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this puzzle, right? The first vision is considered so central to Mormonism today. But for years, it was barely mentioned.
Right. Why so little so late?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why so little so late? So what do your sources say about this?
Well, they offer several possible explanations. One of the key ones is just the sheer chaos of those early years. I mean, think about it. They were starting a new religion from scratch. They were dealing with constant persecution, trying to figure out doctrine, just trying to survive, really.
Right. It makes sense that establishing the church and all that that entailed would take priority over documenting every single event, even if it was important to Joseph personally.
Exactly. They were focused on the present, on building something new. And in that context, the first vision might not have seemed as crucial as it does now.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the idea that Joseph Smith might have been hesitant to share his story because of those early negative reactions he got?
Yeah, that's another possibility that your sources raise. They specifically mentioned the incident with the Methodist preacher who ridiculed Joseph when he told him about the vision. And, that kind of response can be really discouraging, especially when you're talking about something so personal and sacred.
Right. It's like, who wants to keep telling a story that people are just going to make fun of?
Exactly. It's understandable that he might have become more cautious about who he shared it with.
And then there's the whole issue of record keeping.
Right. Your sources really emphasize how difficult it was to keep detailed records in those early years.
Like they were constantly on the move.
Right. They didn't have a lot of money. Some of the people who were helping Joseph with the writing died. It was just incredibly challenging to keep track of everything that was happening.
Wow. And one of your sources even mentions that by late 1839, Joseph Smith had only managed to get about 59 pages of his history written down.
It really highlights how difficult it was to create and preserve historical documentation in that context. And, it's important to remember that simply being public about your religious beliefs, especially if they were considered unconventional, could lead to persecution.
Right.
So that could have also played a role in what they chose to document and when they chose to share it.
Okay, so as the church becomes more established, things start to change, right?
They do.
And your sources talk about how Joseph Smith history, with its detailed account of the first vision, becomes a really important tool for the church.
Right. Especially after its canonization in 1880.
Yeah, once it's part of the scriptures, it's like it takes on this whole new level of importance.
Absolutely. It becomes central to how they understand themselves, their history, their beliefs, and your sources even call it a major literary tool of conversion.
Really?
Yeah. They talk about how missionaries are encouraged to memorize the first vision account and use it to teach people about the church.
Wow. That's a far cry from those early years when it was barely even mentioned.
It really is. And
Yeah.
it shows how the significance of the first vision has evolved over time. It's become this foundational story that they use to explain why the church exists, what they believe, and why people should join them.
Okay, so let's circle back to President Hinckley's statement.
Right. The one where he said that if the first vision didn't happen, then the whole church is a fraud.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, and it underscores just how crucial the first vision has become to Mormonism. For believing members, it's the bedrock of their faith. It's the ultimate proof that Joseph Smith was a prophet and that the church is true.
Okay, so how do we reconcile all this historical information with that kind of faith?
Well, I think for believing members, understanding the historical context can actually deepen their appreciation for how their faith has developed. It shows how certain narratives become more important over time as the church grows and faces new challenges. It doesn't necessarily negate the spiritual truth of the first vision, but it adds layers of complexity to how they understand its significance.
Right, it's like knowing the backstory makes the story even richer.
I- Exactly. But of course, for people who have questions about the church's history or who maybe aren't sure what they believe, this information can be more challenging.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. Like, if it took so long for the first vision to become this central narrative, does that cast doubt on its authenticity?
That's a valid question. And, the existence of these other visionary experiences from around the same time period.
Right, the ones we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. That adds another layer of complexity, right? Because it raises the question of influence. Was Joseph Smith simply drawing on existing cultural narratives, or was his experience truly unique and revelatory?
It's a tough question.
It is. And I think ultimately each individual has to wrestle with that question themselves based on their own understanding of the evidence and their own personal faith journey.
Okay, so where does that leave us? What's the takeaway from all this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the first vision, despite its current centrality to Mormonism, didn't always hold that position. It took decades for it to become the foundational narrative that it is today. And the reasons for that are complex. There were practical considerations like the challenges of establishing a new church, the threat of persecution, the difficulties of record keeping.
Right.
There were also personal factors like Joseph Smith's potential reluctance to share his story after being ridiculed. And the broader religious context, with its emphasis on visionary experiences, adds another layer to the puzzle.
So it's not a simple story, right? It's not just Joseph Smith had a vision and that's how the church started.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced and fascinating story than that. And I think understanding this historical development is important for both believers and those who are questioning their faith.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to leave you, our listeners, with one final thought. Given everything we've talked about today, how does understanding this history of the first vision affect your own view of its significance?
Yeah. How does it change or maybe reinforce your understanding of early Mormonism?
And what questions does it raise for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking discussion, and we hope you found it informative and engaging.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.